Okay, so we stop here under place the user under control. Now we will go to reduce the user's memory load. So when we say reduce the user's memory load, it's actually reducing the short-term memory of the client that you have. So number one is reduce demand on short-term memory. So when we say reduce the demand on short-term memory, the interface shall reduce the user's requirements to remember past actions and results by providing visual cues of such actions. So meaning to say, your graphical user interface should have the capability to let the client remember what was the previous action that she did without telling the client itself that they have to do it. So based on the graphics that they will see, they will remember the previous action that they were able to do, like a history. So another one for that is establishing meaningful defaults. So the system should provide with default values that make sense to the average user but allow the user to change this default. So meaning to say, if the user changed something on the background, there should be an option there to put it back on the default. And then there should be a graphical user interface that will determine or will let the user decide whether what is better, the current configuration or the previous one, so that they can put it back to default just in case they don't like the edited version. The user shall be able to easily reset any value to its original default value. So that's the one that I mentioned earlier, that there should be a default button. Just in case they don't configuration, at least they could go back to the previous configuration. So the third one there is to define shortcuts that are intuitive. So shortcuts that are intuitive, the user should be provided with mnemonics. Example of mnemonics are control or alt combinations like the shortcut keys. So there are websites that if you press alt F4, it will actually close the command itself. So there is also website that will use control C to copy contents. So that's actually making the life of the clients easier compared to them doing it manually. So next one there is the visual layout of the interface should be based on a real world metaphor. So meaning to say we don't want the user to experience a non-realistic graphical user interface so that they can feel that it's personalized. So the screen layout of the user interface shall contain well understood visual cues that the user can relate to real world actions. So that's the one that I've explained earlier. The layout of the interface should be understandable enough and can relate to the client's real world perspective. That's why we are doing interviews before we do the design. Next is disclose information in a progressive fashion. When we say progressive, it's actually changing from one phase to another. So when interacting with a task, an object, or some behavior, the interface shall be organized hierarchically by moving the user progressively in a stepwise fashion from an abstract concept to a concrete action. Example for that is text format, options, a format, dialog box. So just like what you have in Facebook, there's a home button. When you go to the home button, there's another graphical user interface wherein it's all related to the home button, like your personal preferences, your stream, your channel. So that depends on the website. But it should be progressive. Like it should be a little different to the previous interface, but it's related to each other. So next one there is make the interface consistent. So the interface should present and acquire information in a consistent fashion. When we say consistent, it should be clear and progressive. So meaning to say the transition is understandable enough to the client. But don't worry because whenever you do the graphical user interface, it will be depending on the interview with them. So technically, they will be the one deciding on the scenarios, what to click happen when they click that. So it's not more on the problem of you, but it's actually the client side. We just need to follow what they need. So all visual information shall be organized according to design standard that is maintained throughout all screen display. So this is actually dependent on the methodology that you are using. So per methodology, for example, waterfall methodology, um, prototype methodology, it follows a certain arc that a certain designer can use because it's also will be the one that will be used by the programmer themselves. So the designer and then the programmer should work hand on hand with this one. It's like civil engineer and architecture relationship. It's the same because it's also engineering. It's just that we're dealing with digital. Okay, so next, input mechanism shall be constrained to a limited set that is used consistently throughout the application. So meaning to say, when we say a limited set, there should be a standard design that the client wants. So if the client wants this to happen and you think that it's too populated by icons, you can actually suggest to the client to put it on a different category. So when they click another icon, those set of icons will appear there. So we can do categorization per icons. So next is mechanisms for navigating from task to task shall be consistently defined and implemented. So this can easily be done by using different icons and then those icons should actually replicate the the action itself. So the drawing of the icon should replicate what it should be doing. For example, the home button. So we can use a house for a home button. So for like loading, we can use three dots or four dots in a circle. That's actually some of the icons that is being used. Number four, we have to allow the user to put the current task into a meaningful context. So the interface shall provide indicators like windows, styles, consistent color coding that enable the user to know the context of the work at hand. So meaning to say the design that you'll be using there should be similar to the action that that certain page will do. So if it's a home button, so the design and the color coding um should be in line with the colors being used at home. So brown, green. So all of it's actually dependent on the preference of your client. So it will still be dependent on your interview with them. So the next one is the user shall be able to determine. Wait, just bear with me. I'm just going to check the recording. Okay. So the user shall be able to determine where he has come from and what alternative exists for a transition to a new task. So this is the one that I've discussed earlier before as well. So when we say progressive, it should be like it's a growing thing. Like from phase one to phase two, it's leveling up. So if it's a house icon and then you are going to use set of icons related to home like personal preferences, you can use like present personal things like um so personal things, for example, if it's for inventory we can use a bag since organizing your personal things can be put inside a bag. We can also use a drawing of a drawer. So that is dependent on your creativity. So next is maintain consistency across a family of applications. So this is where the category will fall, the one that I'm mentioning earlier. So for those icons that can be categorized in one family, we can put them together. So it should be a set of applications performing complementary functionality shall all implement the same design rules so that consistency is maintained for all interactions. We can actually put them in one page so that it will be consistent. Okay, so next is if past interactive bottles have created user expectations, do not change unless there is a compelling reason to do so. So once a particular interactive sequence has become a de facto standard like Alt S to save a file, the application shall continue this expectation in every part of its functionality. So you should base it from the standard that is being used in the technology side. So mostly the ones being used by Microsoft, by Google. So those standards. So now we will go to reconciling four different models. So the four different models that we have is user profile model, design model, implementation model, user's mental model. So the first one, which is user user profile model established by a human engineer or a software engineer. So based on the age, gender, physical abilities, education, cultural or ethnic background, motivation, goals, and personality. So it's actually dependent on the profile-based interview that you will be doing with the client. So your interview should indicate the age, the gender, the physical abilities, education, cultural, or ethnic background, motivation, goals, and personality. Because that is where you will actually get an idea what is the preference of that certain client. And the design of your software that you will initially present to the client will be dependent on their personality. So under the user profile model, we should also consider syntactic knowledge of the user. So the mechanics of interaction that are required to use the interface effectively. So that is still dependent on the personality of your client, the different interaction, but you will be the one to suggest how it will be effective to them. So once you present it to them, you will need to discuss how this one would be effective. And then they will be the one to decide whether it's a yes or a no for them. So next is we should consider semantic knowledge of the user. When we say semantic, it's the underlying sense of the application, an understanding of the functions that are performed or the meaning of the input and output and the objectives of the system. So you will actually base it on the objectives that your client will be telling you to do so. The interface design for that, the semantic design. So there are different categories of the users of a system. When we say novice, these are just new. So they don't have knowledge on the system. It can be a little knowledge on the application or they only know general application of a computer system. Another category of a user is knowledgeable or intermittent user. When we say knowledgeable or intermittent user, they know something about the design, the computer, the software, but they are not using it regularly. So when they are tagged as like this one, they will just use it whenever they need to. So normally if they have to perform a certain optional task, but it's not required for them to use this. That's why they are tagged as intermittent user. We also have a third kind of user. So a third kind of user is a frequent user. So mostly this will fall with um, the users of that software that uses it every day. For example, if you use Facebook every day, you're a frequent user of Facebook. So if you are, for example, playing ML every day, you are a frequent user of that. So you are considered as a frequent user if you use it almost every day, not just whenever you need to. So we will now move on to the design model. So the design model, it is derived from the analysis model of the requirement. So it's still dependent on the methodology that you will be using. So it normally incorporates the data, the architectural interface, and the procedural representations of the software. So you will actually see all of it when you are ready on the methodology part. I'm not sure if it will be discussed here. Maybe in system analysis and design it will be discussed, but we will see later in the syllabus if it's considered to be part of that. So the design model is also constrained by information in the requirements, a specification that helps define the user of the system. So it all boils down to going back to this part here on how you first design the software using this one. You should also follow the standard depending on the methodology that you're going to be using. So normally, it is incidental to other parts of the design model, but in many cases, it is as important as the other parts. So on this part, we are talking about the relationship of the blocks to each other inside the design model. So I have here an example of a design. So let's say, for example, we have a dialog box and we have a status display box. So the dialog box, it actually indicates what the action is all about. Then the status display, what is the status of that certain box right now? Is it active? Is it inactive? And then we have also that a task agent. This is just an example. This is not generic for all system. This is just a system for a dialog box. So task agent is this is the one being used to perform that certain task for that dialog box. So all related agent that needs to be used to support the function of the dialog box. So the file transfer agent, if ever that the dialog box needs to have a file transfer, it will have a file transfer agent and then it will be moved to the task agent to be put in the dialog box. So this is just my example of it. But it's not a generic design model. This is just one example of a design model or an algorithm which will be needed whenever, for example, you're working already on a project or a thesis. This will be required for you. All algorithms needs to have a design model on how that algorithm will function so that the readers will understand how your system will work. So we also have an implementation model. So normally the implementation model is just the step-by-step procedure, but it's translated into a block diagram. So from phase one up to phase two of your system, you would see how it will progress from one phase to another using that block diagram. Okay, so it should normally consist of looks and feels of the interface combined with all supporting information like books, videos, help files to describe the system. The syntax is your code and then the semantics. So the semantics are the actions involved on how the system will work. in respect to the design itself. The implementation model also should strives to agree with the user's mental model. So later we'll discuss the user's mental model. Users then will feel comfortable with the software and use it effectively because we are talking about how it will be implemented and will be tested on the user side and on the IT expert side. So it will serve as a translation of the design model by providing realization of the information contained in the user profile model and the user's mental model. So this will be your basis for your implementation. So before you do the implementation part, there should be a block diagram that represent the steps that you're gonna be doing so that you will not be confused and you will do it systematically to avoid error. Now we will move on to the user's mental model. The user's mental model normally consists of the user's system perception, the image of the system that the users carry in their heads. So it's actually how you draw it when your client is describing it. It should be based on that certain live wire. Because before you actually do the mental model, you do the live wire based on your interview with the client. And then you present the live wire to your client. The live wire is like a drawing of the prototype on how the first interface will connect to the second interface to the third interface going back to the first interface again depending on your interview with the client. So accuracy of the description depends upon the user's profile and overall familiarity with the software in the application domain. So you will actually observe that while doing the interview with the client. How well versed how well versed they are with the software that they want you to design. To the user interface analysis. So user interface analysis, first we are going to discuss the elements of the user interface. So to perform a interface analysis, the practitioner needs to study and understand four elements. So what are these four elements that you have to understand before doing the interface? First is we should understand the user. The user is the one that will interact with the system all throughout the interface from phase 1 to phase ending, whatever the end of your interface is. You should also be familiar with the task that end users must perform to do their work. So this will be dependent on the interview. You will ask what are the tasks that they need to perform on the software. And the interface will be dependent on that. So you also should be familiar with the content. The content is the one presented as part of the interface. So the content is, let's say, for example, your system is all about um, school administration system. So the contents of that would be the student information, their grades, their enrollment, their subjects. So that will also appear on your interview with your client. So next is the work environment in which this task will be conducted. So where are they going to use the software? Is it for school, for a government office? Because the design would be dependent on that. Later, I will show you one of the designs that I'm working on. And then let's see if you would be able to decipher which office is using it. So the next one for the user interface analysis is the analyst should strive to get the end user's mental model and the design model to converge by understanding. So the user themselves and then how these people use the system. So there are two things that you need to prepare for this second part. One is the mental model, which we've discussed earlier. So the mental model is the one that your client described and then the one that you drawn. And then the design model, it is the one that you presented to your client for the initial design. So next we will go to the information can be obtained from the following. So um, these are the methods that we can use to get the information that we need to create the interface. So number one, we have the user interview. So I've been saying this since the beginning that it will be dependent on the user interview because it is the most important part of you designing the system. So next is the sales input from the salespeople who will interact with the customers and users on a regular basis. So you should ask the user what the software is for, and then if they are going to use it to serve another person, they should also get the inputs from that users as well because they will be the one like it's a two-way interaction. The middleman is the software. So let's say, for example, it's a school administration software. So the one that will be using it will be the registrar, but the student should be involved because the information will be put there. So what are the important information that the student needs to consider? Their data privacy, so how the information will be cascaded. So all of those things are needed as well. So another is marketing input. So based on market analysis to understand how different population segments may use the software. So this will be depending on your census. So it will be depending on your survey. Normally you do this on the questionnaire using a Likert scale. Next is support input from the support staff who are aware of what works and what doesn't, what users like and dislike, what features generate questions, and what features are easy to use. So normally this support input will appear after your initial presentation with the client. Okay, so next is you should have a set of questions that should be answered during user analysis. So it will be a guide for you to analyze the user themselves. So here are the questions. So sample questions are the users trained, professional, technicians, clerical, or manufacturing workers? So it will be on your interview with the client. So I do suggest if you are going to do this, get a recorder so that you should remember what your clients answer. So this is not a generic question. You will be the one to create your own question depending who is your client, what the software is for, and what are your requirements from the client. This is just our guide or sample questions to analyze the user themselves. So now we will move on to task analysis and modeling. So normally task analysis strives to know and understand the following. First is the work the user performs in specific circumstances. So what are the types of work that will be involved when the user will use the software themselves? Are they going to just use it for recording information or they are going to use it to be synced into an LMS program so that they can monitor the attendance of their teachers? So those are the things that needs to be considered. So another thing that the analyst should strive to know and understand is the task and the subtask that will be performed under the user's work. So that will also be included on your guide questions. You should know what are the task and subtask that the user would needs to perform, because the system should actually replicate that, because the purpose of a system is to make the work of the client lesser using physical effort. That's normally, we've discussed that before from our week 1 to week 5 topics. So the analyst should also understand the specific problem domain objects that the user manipulate as work is performed. So what might be, you should know what might be the possible problems that the client will experience during the software, because it's either you will solve it or you will put it under the limitations and future research of your system. So you should assess yourself, can I do it or not? If I cannot do it, then put it on the limitation and future study, because there are different things to consider why you cannot do it. Maybe the technology nowadays is not enough to perform that. Maybe in the future, let's say for example, during the time that the Matrix was shown in cinemas, augmented reality is not yet a technology, but they are already forecasting that it's a possible technology that can be used in the future. And nowadays, it's an easy thing to do, doing augmented reality, because of the popularity of Pokemon Go. So other things that the analyst should understand by when analyzing their system is the sequence of work task. So it will be depending on your system flowchart, and then the hierarchy of task. So which task will come first? This one would be dependent on your this one is dependent on your different design models per algorithm, because you will need to actually put it one by one. So for example, you have one algorithm for face recognition, then you should have a separate model for that, separate from a voice recognition model. So if all of that is part, okay, so the use cases, this is also a model. So you will encounter this when you are already on your system analysis and design, because it's actually a sub model that you can use to replace your block diagram. So if your user or the software that you are using for your client doesn't require a hardware, you can use a use case diagram instead of a block diagram. So the use case diagram is the same sample that I've shown you on our first week when I show you all of my publications. So if you want to see it again, just go back to my ResearchGate page or Google Scholar page. Click one of my research. Example of the use. Okay, I think I have been muted by someone. So what are the purpose of this use case? This will show how an end user performs some specific work related task. So as you can see on my example before, when I shown it to you, for my system, I have there the teacher and then the student. Then there will be an arrow. What are the tasks that the student can only perform? What are the tasks that the teacher can only perform? And also the system admin. It will also enable the software engineer to extract task, objects, and overall workflow action. So inside that use case diagram, you can point out what will be the next task after the first one. So for example, your system is school administration software. Your case diagram is composed of the registrar. The registrar, click on login. So you will put the arrow from the registrar's drawing going to login, and then from login, going to the next task. So it can be input grades or encode student. So just put it there. In a use case diagram, we are not allowed to use sentences. We have to use space because it's just a limited space that we have when we actually draw a use case diagram. So maybe in our future discussion, I can teach you how to do a use case diagram to help you in preparation for your different subjects for third year. So another purpose of the use case diagram, it helps the software engineer to identify additional helpful features because all of the features will be labeled there. And what are the loop that is involved on the system. So after clicking this, does the system needs to go back to the beginning or not? It should be indicated there on the use case diagram. Okay, so now we will move on to the content analysis. The content analysis, the content display may range from character-based reports to a graphical display to multimedia information. So you just need to analyze here if the contents are related to each other and if your content is complementing your design. Okay. So next is the display content may be this tree. So first is generated by components in other parts of the application. So it, for example, my button earlier is home. So when you press home, all of the components related to home will be inside that home page. And then the content may be acquired also from data stored in a database that is accessible from the application. So there are things, if you are familiar with PHP, there is a way for you to actually get the contents from the database and show it as an output in your system. So in that case, you don't need to design the content. You just need to design the interface. The content will be automatic because it will be coming from the database. And your design would be dependent on your CSS declaration. So the content may also be transmitted from systems external to the application in question. So we may have an import or we may also have an import or an export function to get out the content to a certain report or to get the content from an Excel, you can import that Excel to your program and then it will replicate all of that information. So in content analysis, you should also be checking on the format and aesthetics of the content. So when we say the aesthetic of the content, is the design really complementing the content and the usage of the software? So those are the sample questions that we may have on our mind while doing that. So next is there should be a set of questions that should be answered during content analysis. So you will do the same like this, but all of the questions should be related to the contents and the usage of the contents. So next is the guidelines for content analysis. So these are just the sample that I have. Same with this one here. So you can actually do your own. This one, I've used it several times. Okay, so I think you were able to read them enough. So you can do your own, same like this one. Don't worry, I'll be uploading this document on our Teams. So next is the work environment analysis. So work environment analysis is where the software will be used. In what workplace? So example of work environment are school, government agency like DSWD. So dependent on the analysis is dependent on the type. So what do we need to consider? So software products need to be designed to fit into the work environment. So the design should be, for example, if you are working in a school that normally uses red background, then you might as well be using dominant red on your backgrounds. So you have to pick the colors that are dominant to what they are using. Okay, so these are the factors to be considered on a work environment analysis. The type of lighting. So is the design works well with the lighting that the office has? Display size and height. So is the display size of your system should complement with the size of the monitor that they are using, because there is a definite size of all of the workstations that they are using. So other things are keyboard size, height, ease of use, surrounding noise, space limitation for computer, user weather or other atmospheric conditions, temperature or pressure restrictions, time restrictions, how fast, how long. So those are the different work environment analysis that we need to decide. Is the work environment a fast-paced one like a BPO? Is it a secured is it a secured one? Like soldiers. So we should consider all of those things because our system will be dependent on that. There are some workplace that don't want to have a live stream because of the security. So we also need to consider those. So now move on to the user interface design. So the user interface design is an iterative process where each iteration elaborates and refines the information developed in the preceding step. So general steps for the user interface design. Number one is using information developed during interface analysis defines the user interface objects and action. So after we do the different analysis now, we will now start the design depending on the questions that we have and the answers to those questions. So we have to define also the events that will cause the state of the user interface to change or the model of the behavior. So if they click on register, what should be the next is B, and what are the informations inside it. So the design will be dependent on the information needed, how many columns, how many boxes is needed. So it will also depict each interface state as it will actually look to the end user. So this is depending on the live wire that you have using the mental model that you've designed before. So next is indicate how the user interprets the state of the system from information provided through the interface. So this will be dependent on your interview with the client. So also on the mental model. So the design on this space would be all dependent on the mental model that we designed with the client. So no need to change anything. You will just need to transfer that. You just need to transfer that from a drawing, from your drawing to a 3D version of the design. And then you will need to check if your design is really matching the mental model of the client. If you actually see that it's not matching, might as well go back, to your client and then ask your client what are the changes that you need to perform to actually meet the needs of your client themselves. So next is during all of these steps, the designer of the interface should always follow the three golden rules of the user interface design. So how the model will be implemented. So we've discussed on the upper part the different golden rules like place the user in control and etc. That will be dependent on that. So next is the designer must also consider the computing environment. So the technology that will be used on the software, the operating system, the development tools that you will use. So all of this um, will be needed before you do the design. So if you are working on a thesis, normally this is under chapter 2. And then your design will be under chapter 3. So before you do the design, you have the list already because you've done this on your chapter 2 of the project. So next is interface objects and action. So the interface objects in action, these are the elements present on your design. So the buttons, the links, the hyperlinks. So interface objects and actions are obtained from grammatical parts of the use cases and the software problem statement. So all of these are present already before you do the design. You already have a stated problem. So I already trained you on how to get a problem. So you know how to get a problem. And then the use case diagram, if we have additional time after we've discussed everything, I will teach you how to do that so that it's not part of our subject, but I will actually teach you on how to do it because in preparation for your next subjects because I don't want you to in other words ayoko nang nangangapa kayo sa mga susunod na subject. So if we still have time, we might I might be able to teach you that. Okay, so next is the interface objects are normally categorized into source, target, and application. So normally the source object is drag and drop into a target object. That's why it's called target because the source will be dragged there, such as to create a hard copy of a report. So example, you are going to get the list of the students enrolled for that semester. So the source object will be drop into the target object. So which is the target object should be the import button. And then the import button will be getting the information from the database. And then import the information on the design that you've created on a certain reporting basis. So an application object, on the other hand, it represents application-specific data that are not directly manipulated as part of the screen interaction, such as a list. So normally, it's the background interaction of your software. So it's normally indicated if you are working on HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and SQL. It's normally depending on the JavaScript code. So it's actually the behavior of your system depending on the code that you input on your JavaScript. So on that other hand, you will actually know that when you are ready on your web development subject. So after identifying objects and their actions, an interface designer performs a screen layout, which involves the following: graphical design and placement of icons, definition, descriptive screen text, a specification and tilting for the windows, definition of major and minor menu items, and then specifications of a real-world metaphor to follow. So all of that has been discussed on the upper part of our discussion. So from part 1 up to this part 2, we've discussed those certain things. So these design issues to consider, you can just actually read them because they are self-explanatory. So design issues to consider. We also have guidelines for error message. These are also self-explanatory. So I made it understandable enough for everybody so that when you read it on your asynchronous later, it will be easier for you to decipher the guidelines themselves. So these are also the sample questions that I have. So for the user interface evaluation, it's actually dependent on the user interface analysis. So just apply this and then you can now evaluate it. So this will just actually be short. So design and prototype evaluation. So before prototyping occurs, a number of evaluation criteria can be applied during design reviews to the design model itself. So the amount of learning required by the user, the interaction time and overall efficiency, the memory load on the users. So all of this has been discussed earlier. You just need to consider this when you are analyzing and evaluating your design and the prototype themselves. So normally prototype evaluation can range from an informal test drive to a formally designed study using statistical method and questionnaire. So most common here is Likert scale. So I'm not sure if you have a subject statistical analysis using software, but normally it's being discussed there. It's actually your basis. It's actually your basis on how you are going to evaluate your prototype. Are you going to pass it or not? This will also be the basis of the panel of experts that will be involved, including the IT expert. So just make sure that you take note of those. So the prototype is normally evaluated for the following purposes: satisfaction of user requirements. We've discussed this before. Conformance to the three golden rules of user interface design. We've discussed it. And reconciliation of the four models of a user interface design. And we've also discussed that. So all of them are self-explanatory and we've discussed them on the upper part. We just cascaded and consolidated them so that you can use them for design and prototype evaluation. Okay, so I have here some example of different depending on their. So Thank you so much for listening.